The gunshot echoed across the Montana plains as Delilah Turner staggered into view, her once white dress now stained crimson, her eyes wild with fear and exhaustion. Dakota Vance, sitting alone on his porch in the fading daylight outside Salida, reached for his revolver instinctively. It was 1879, and lone women didn't just appear out of nowhere on the edge of town, especially not bleeding women clutching bundles to their chests. "Just kill me fast," she said, her voice barely a whisper as she collapsed at his feet. The bundle in her arms moved slightly, and Dakota's brow furrowed as he knelt beside her. With trembling hands, he opened the blanket and found a newborn child, pink-faced and mewling softly. Dakota's heart hammered in his chest. At 32, he'd seen his share of strange sights across the frontier, but nothing had prepared him for this. The woman, she couldn't be more than 25, looked up at him with pleading eyes. "Please," she whispered. "They'll kill her too if they find her." Without another word, Dakota scooped up both mother and child, carrying them into his modest homestead. Blood soaked through his shirt as he laid the woman on his bed, the infant still cradled in her arms. "You need a doctor," he said, moving to the door. "No." The force of her objection startled him. "No doctors. No one can know we're here." Dakota ran a hand through his dark hair, assessing the woman's wound. A bullet had grazed her side, painful but not immediately fatal if he could stop the bleeding. "What's your name?" he asked, gathering clean linens from a chest. "Grace," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Grace Thompson." "Well, Grace Thompson, I'm Dakota Vance, and you've got some explaining to do, but first let me tend to that wound." Dakota worked methodically, cleaning and bandaging her injury as best he could with the limited supplies he had. The baby had fallen asleep, tiny fists clenched against the blanket. "Your daughter?" he asked, nodding toward the infant, Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, Eleanor." "She's barely 2 weeks old. And who exactly is trying to kill you both?" Grace turned her face away. "My husband's business partner, Marshall Quinn, he killed my husband 3 days ago, said there was too much money at stake to share with a family man." Dakota's jaw tightened. He'd heard of Quinn, a cattle baron with political aspirations and a reputation for ruthlessness. The man had connections throughout the territory. "You're safe here for now," Dakota said, though he wasn't entirely convinced. His homestead lay a mile outside of Salida, isolated enough to provide temporary shelter but not remote enough to remain hidden indefinitely. "Get some rest. We'll figure something out come morning." As Grace drifted into fitful sleep, Dakota settled into a chair by the window, rifle across his lap. Outside, the Montana night spread like an ink stain across the landscape, stars piercing the darkness with cold, distant light. The baby stirred occasionally, making soft sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. Dakota had come to Montana 5 years earlier, seeking solitude after the war had hollowed him out. He'd built this place with his own hands, determined to live simply and alone. Now, in a single night, his carefully constructed isolation had been shattered by a desperate woman and her newborn child. Dawn broke with pale fingers of light stretching across the floorboards. Dakota hadn't slept, his eyes burning with fatigue as he checked on Grace. Her fever had broken sometime in the night, and her breathing seemed steadier. The baby, however, was awake and fussing. With awkward hands, Dakota lifted the tiny bundle. "SHH," he murmured. "Your mama needs rest." Grace's eyes fluttered open at the sound. "She's hungry," she said weakly. "I need to feed her." Dakota turned away to give her privacy, busying himself at the stove. "I don't have much," he said over his shoulder, "but I can make you some breakfast. You'll need your strength." "Why are you helping us?" Grace asked, her voice stronger than it had been the previous night. "You don't know me. You're putting yourself in danger." Dakota considered the question as he stirred a pot of oatmeal. "I suppose I've seen enough people not help when it mattered. Changes a man's thinking." He brought her a bowl and watched as she ate one-handed, the baby still nursing at her breast. In the morning light, he could see her more clearly honey-colored hair matted with dirt and blood, green eyes sharp with intelligence despite her exhaustion, and a stubborn set to her jaw that spoke of determination. "We can't stay," Grace said, setting aside the empty bowl. "Quinn has men all through this territory. He'll find us." You can barely stand, Dakota pointed out. And where would you go? California, she replied without hesitation. My sister lives in San Francisco. She'd take us in. Dakota scratched at his beard. That's a long journey for a wounded woman and a newborn. We don't have a choice. A dog barked in the distance and Grace tensed. Dakota moved to the window, scanning the horizon. Just my neighbor's hound, he said, but the tension remained in the room like a living thing. I should leave today, Grace insisted, attempting to rise. Dakota gently pressed her back down. You'll tear your stitches. Give yourself at least a day to regain some strength. I'll ride into town, see if I can learn anything about Quinn's movements. Grace caught his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. Be careful, don't ask directly about him, and don't mention us to anyone. Dakota nodded, struck by the fierce protectiveness in her eyes. He'd seen that look before in mothers protecting their young, in soldiers defending their brothers in arms. It was a dangerous look, the kind that could get people killed or keep them alive against impossible odds. He saddled his horse, a steady chestnut gelding named Copper, and rode the short distance into Salida. The town had grown considerably in recent years, boasting a proper main street with a general store, saloon, hotel, and various other establishments. Dakota tied Copper outside the general store and stepped inside, nodding to Tom Harding, the proprietor. Vance, Tom greeted him. Unusual to see you twice in 1 month, Dakota shrugged, running low on supplies. He gathered what he needed: extra bandages, a tin of condensed milk, coffee, and other necessities. As Tom tallied his purchases, Dakota casually asked, "Any news worth hearing?" Tom's eyes lit up. He was known for his gossip. Well, there's talk of a new railroad spur coming through, might bring more business. And there was some trouble over at the Diamond Q Ranch, that's Quinn's place. One of his partners was found dead 3 days back, shot through the heart. Dakota kept his expression neutral. That's so, MMM. Quinn's offering a reward for information about the man's wife. Says she might know something about the killing. $500 dead or alive. Tom lowered his voice. Between you and me, I'd put my money on Quinn himself doing the deed. That man's ambition runs cold as a snake. Dakota paid for his goods, his mind racing. Thanks, Tom. I'll see you around. Outside, he secured his purchases to Copper's saddle, then made his way to the saloon. If there was anywhere to gather information without arousing suspicion, it was over a whiskey. The Red Spur was already doing decent business despite the early hour. Dakota took a seat at the bar, ordered a drink, and kept his ears open. It didn't take long to hear Quinn's name mentioned. Got men searching all the way to the territorial line, a weather-beaten cowhand was saying. Quinn's mighty determined to find that woman. What'd she do? His companion asked. Supposedly killed her husband, Quinn's partner Thompson, and stole some papers. Quinn says they're worth a fortune, land deeds or some such. Dakota downed his whiskey, left a coin on the bar, and exited without drawing attention. Grace hadn't mentioned any papers, but it made sense. Quinn wouldn't be hunting her so aggressively just for witnessing a murder. There had to be more at stake. When he returned to the homestead, he found Grace sitting in a chair by the window, the baby asleep in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a drawer. She'd washed her face and combed her hair, and despite the pallor of her skin, she looked more like a living woman than the ghost who'd appeared on his doorstep the night before. Quinn's men are searching the territory, Dakota said without preamble. They're telling people you killed your husband and stole valuable papers. Grace's laugh was bitter. Of course they are. Did you believe them? I don't believe much of anything without proof, Dakota replied, but I'm curious about these papers. Grace was silent for a long moment, weighing her words. Finally, she reached into her bodice and withdrew a folded document. This is what he wants, she said. My husband, William, discovered that Quinn has been falsifying land claims, stealing property from small ranchers by forging documents, bribing officials. This paper proves it. It's got Quinn's signature alongside the county registrar's admission of fraud. Dakota examined the document. It was damning evidence, indeed enough to ruin Quinn and possibly send him to prison. William was going to expose him, Grace continued, her voice tight with grief. He believed in doing what was right, and Quinn shot him for it right in front of me. I grabbed Eleanor and ran. I didn't know where to go. I just knew I had to get away to protect her and this evidence. Dakota carefully refolded the paper and returned it to Grace. This makes things more complicated. Quinn won't stop until he has this back. I know, Grace whispered, looking down at her sleeping daughter. That's why we need to leave as soon as possible. Dakota paced the small room, thinking, the stage doesn't come through for another 3 days. Even then, you'd be too exposed. Quinn's likely watching the stage stations. Then we'll need to find another way, Grace said firmly. Dakota stopped pacing. I have a wagon. We could head west, avoid the main routes. It would be slow going with the baby, but we might make it to Idaho before Quinn realizes which direction you've taken. Grace raised an eyebrow. You can't manage alone, not with your injury and the baby, Dakota said matter-of-factly. Besides, I know the back trails, and I've got no love for men like Quinn who think they can take whatever they want. Grace studied him intently. Why would you do this? You'd be risking everything. Dakota looked around his simple home. Not much to risk, truth be told. Been thinking lately that Montana's getting too crowded anyway. The faintest smile touched Grace's lips. You're a strange man, Dakota Vance. So I've been told, he replied, returning the smile. We'll leave tomorrow, before first light. They spent the remainder of the day preparing. Dakota packed supplies, checked his weapons, and readied the wagon while Grace tended to Eleanor and rested as much as possible. By nightfall, they were as ready as they could be for the journey ahead. After a simple supper, Dakota brought out a bottle of whiskey and 2 cups. To steady the nerves, he explained, pouring a modest amount for each of them. Grace accepted the cup, their fingers brushing momentarily. I haven't thanked you properly, she said quietly. You saved our lives. Dakota shook his head. Don't thank me yet. We've still got a long road ahead. They sat in companionable silence as darkness settled around the cabin. Eleanor slept peacefully, oblivious to the danger surrounding her young life. Tell me about your husband, Dakota said eventually. Pain flashed across Grace's face, but she nodded. William was kind. Intelligent. We met in St. Louis. I was teaching at a girls' school, and he was working for a shipping company. He had dreams of raising horses in the West. When he formed a partnership with Quinn, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. She took a sip of whiskey. We were married for 3 years. Eleanor was unexpected, a blessing but unexpected. He sounds like a good man. He was, Grace said softly. He deserved better than to die in the dirt at the hands of a greedy coward. She looked up at Dakota. What about you? Have you always been alone out here? Dakota swirled the amber liquid in his cup. Not always. I was married once before the war. Her name was Sarah. She died of fever while I was away fighting. I'm sorry, Grace said. It was a long time ago, Dakota replied, though the pain in his eyes suggested otherwise. After the war, I drifted, worked cattle drives, did some scouting for the army, eventually found my way here, built this place. It's been quiet. Until I showed up bleeding on your doorstep, Grace added. Dakota's mouth quirked. Life has a way of changing when you least expect it. They finished their drinks, and Dakota insisted Grace take the bed while he made a pallet near the door. Neither slept much, too aware of what morning would bring, and of the dangers that might come in the night. Long before dawn, Dakota rose and finished loading the wagon. He hitched up his 2 draft horses, solid animals built for endurance rather than speed. Speed wouldn't serve them well on the rough trails they'd be taking. Grace emerged from the cabin wearing a pair of Dakota's trousers beneath her dress, which she'd cut and altered during the night. She carried Eleanor, wrapped securely against her chest. Ready? Dakota asked. Grace nodded, determination evident in the set of her shoulders. Ready. Dakota helped them into the wagon, then went back to secure the cabin. He looked around one last time at the home he'd built, not knowing if he'd ever see it again. Then, without regret, he climbed onto the wagon seat, took up the reins, and guided the horses westward into the fading night. They traveled in silence as dawn broke over the landscape, painting the rolling hills in hues of gold and amber. Dakota kept to game trails and cattle paths, avoiding the main roads where Quinn's men might be watching. The wagon jostled over the uneven terrain, and Grace winced occasionally when a particularly rough patch jarred her wounded side, but she never complained. By mid-morning, they'd put several miles between themselves and Salida. Dakota drew the wagon to a halt in a copse of cottonwoods beside a small stream to rest the horses and allow Grace to tend to Eleanor. "We're making good time," he said, helping Grace down from the wagon. "If we keep this pace, we should reach the mountains in 3 days." Grace settled against a tree trunk to feed Eleanor. "And then, there's a pass that's not well known. It's difficult but passable with a wagon if we're careful. Once we're through, we'll be in Idaho territory. From there, we can make our way to Oregon and then down to California." "How long will that take?" Dakota considered. 6 weeks, maybe more. Depends on the weather and how many stops we need to make." Grace's expression was a mixture of determination and concern. "Eleanor will be 2 months old by then. She'll be a seasoned traveler," Dakota said with a gentle smile, "like her mother." They ate a cold breakfast of biscuits and jerky, then continued their journey. The day grew warm. The sun beating down on the canvas cover Dakota had rigged over the wagon to provide shade. Eleanor slept most of the time, waking only to nurse and be changed. As evening approached, Dakota guided the wagon into a sheltered ravine where they would camp for the night. After unhitching the horses, he gathered wood for a small fire. "Is it safe to light one?" Grace asked, watching him arrange the kindling. "Safer than going without," Dakota replied. "Nights get cold up here and the ravine will hide the light. Besides, we're far enough from the main trails that it's unlikely anyone would spot us." Once the fire was burning steadily, Dakota prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional soft noises from Eleanor. "How's your side?" Dakota asked as Grace shifted position. "Better," she said. "Your doctoring skills are surprisingly good," Dakota chuckled. "When you live alone in the wilderness, you learn to patch yourself up, though I'll admit I've had more practice with horses than people." Grace smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, softening the wariness that had become a constant companion. "Well, I'm grateful regardless," she said, "for everything." Dakota nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to meet her eyes. There was something about Grace Thompson that unsettled him, not in an unpleasant way, but in a manner that made him acutely aware of how long he'd been alone. After dinner, Dakota spread bedrolls beneath the wagon, providing some protection from the elements while keeping them concealed. Grace settled with Eleanor beside her, and Dakota took a position at the edge of their makeshift camp, rifle within easy reach. "Sleep," he told her. "I'll keep watch for a while." Grace nodded, too exhausted to argue. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into sleep. Dakota stared into the dying embers of the fire, his thoughts turning to the woman and child he'd somehow become responsible for. It had been years since he'd felt this kind of connection to another human being, this instinctive need to protect. It was both terrifying and oddly comforting. The night passed without incident, and they were on the move again before sunrise. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they progressed westward, the rolling plains giving way to foothills dotted with pine and aspen. Dakota navigated carefully, mindful of the wagon's limitations and Grace's still healing wound. On the third day, as they were making their way through a narrow valley, Dakota suddenly reined in the horses. "What is it?" Grace asked, instantly alert. Dakota pointed silently to a plume of dust in the distance, moving across the valley floor. "Riders," he said grimly. 4, maybe 5 of them." Grace clutched Eleanor closer. "Quinn's men, can't be sure, but we can't take chances." Dakota quickly turned the wagon toward a dense stand of trees. "We need to get out of sight." He guided the team into the forest, following a barely visible game trail until they were well hidden from the valley. After securing the horses, Dakota crept back to the edge of the tree line with his spyglass. The riders were closer now, and through the glass, Dakota could see they were armed men moving with purpose. One of them pointed in the direction Dakota and Grace had been traveling, and the group adjusted their course accordingly. "They're following our trail," Dakota said when he returned to the wagon. "They'll find where we turned off soon enough." Grace's face paled. "What do we do?" Dakota was already untying the horses from the wagon. "We abandon the wagon. Take only what we can carry on horseback." Working quickly, they gathered essential supplies: food, water, ammunition, and the few items Grace had for Eleanor. Dakota saddled one of the draft horses and helped Grace mount, then handed Eleanor up to her. The baby protested briefly at being disturbed but settled against her mother's chest. "Stay low and follow me," Dakota instructed, mounting the other horse. "These old boys aren't built for speed, but they're sure-footed. We'll head up into the higher country where the wagons can't follow." They set off at a steady pace, climbing higher into the forested slopes. Dakota led them along rocky ground whenever possible, hoping to obscure their trail. The horses labored up the steep terrain, their powerful muscles straining with each step. After an hour of hard riding, they paused in a small clearing to rest the animals. In the distance, they could hear shouts Quinn's men had found the abandoned wagon. "They'll split up to search," Dakota said, his expression grim. "We need to keep moving." Grace nodded, exhaustion evident in every line of her body, but determination burning in her eyes. "I'm ready." They continued their ascent, the forest growing denser around them. By late afternoon, they had reached a high ridge that offered a view of the valley below. Dakota dismounted and helped Grace down, then scanned the terrain with his spyglass. "I can see 3 of them," he reported. "They're still searching, but they're headed in the wrong direction." Grace slumped against a boulder, relief washing over her face. "We've lost them, for now," Dakota cautioned. "But Quinn isn't a man who gives up easily. We need to keep moving until we reach the pass." They made camp that night in a sheltered hollow, not daring to light a fire despite the chill in the mountain air. Dakota wrapped Grace and Eleanor in both blankets, insisting he was used to the cold. As the stars emerged overhead, Grace studied Dakota's profile in the dim light. "You could have left us," she said softly, "back at the wagon. You could have pointed those men in my direction and saved yourself." Dakota looked at her, surprise evident in his expression. "That thought never crossed my mind. Why not? You barely know us." Dakota was silent for a long moment. "Some choices aren't really choices at all," he finally said. "They're just the only decent path forward." Grace reached out and touched his hand, her fingers cool against his skin. "You're a good man, Dakota Vance, better than most." Dakota gently squeezed her hand before releasing it. "Get some sleep. We've got a hard day ahead tomorrow." The next morning dawned clear and cold. They ate a hasty breakfast of jerky and hardtack, then continued their journey. The terrain grew increasingly difficult, with narrow trails winding through rocky outcroppings and dense stands of pine. Dakota led them confidently, though Grace noticed he checked their back trail frequently. By midday, they had reached a high meadow carpeted with wildflowers. In the distance, a jagged mountain pass was visible. "That's our way through," Dakota said, pointing. "Once we're on the other side, we'll be in Idaho territory." Grace shifted Eleanor to her other arm, wincing slightly. "How long to reach it?" "A day, maybe more. The trail gets treacherous near the top." They were crossing the meadow when the first shot rang out, the bullet kicking up dirt near Dakota's horse. The animal reared in panic, nearly throwing him. "Ride," Dakota shouted, drawing his revolver and firing back toward the tree line where the shot had originated. "Head for those rocks." Grace spurred her horse forward, clutching Eleanor tightly against her as they galloped across the open ground. Dakota followed, providing covering fire as more shots erupted behind them. They reached the shelter of a massive boulder formation just as a bullet grazed Dakota's arm. He dismounted quickly, helping Grace and Eleanor down before tying the horses in a protected alcove. "Are you hit?" Grace asked, her voice tight with fear as she noticed the blood on his sleeve. "Just a scratch," Dakota assured her, though the wound burned fiercely. "Stay low." He peered around the edge of the boulder. 3 riders had emerged from the trees and were advancing cautiously across the meadow. "Quinn's men," Grace whispered. Dakota nodded grimly. "They must have split up, guessed which way we'd head." He checked his ammunition. "I've got 6 shots in the revolver, another 12 for the rifle." "I can shoot," Grace said, surprising him. "William taught me." Dakota hesitated, then handed her the revolver. "Only if they get close, save your shots." The men had dismounted now and were spreading out, using the uneven ground for cover as they approached. One man, taller than the others with a distinctive red bandana, shouted across the distance. "We know you're there, Thompson. Quinn wants his property back and the woman dead." "Hand them over and you might live," Dakota's jaw tightened. He raised the rifle and fired, the shot striking the ground near Red Bandana, forcing him to dive for cover. "That's my answer," Dakota called back. A furious exchange of gunfire followed. Dakota picked his shots carefully, aware of their limited ammunition. One of Quinn's men cried out and fell, clutching his leg. The others became more cautious, working their way closer using the natural features of the landscape for protection. "They're trying to flank us," Dakota muttered, reloading the rifle. "We can't stay here." Grace peered through a gap between boulders. "There's a ravine behind us if we could reach it." Dakota nodded. "I'll cover you. When I start firing, take Eleanor and make for the ravine. Stay low and don't stop." Grace's eyes met his, fear and determination mingling in their depths. "And you? I'll be right behind you," he promised. Grace cradled Eleanor, who had remained remarkably quiet throughout the gunfire, and prepared to run. Dakota took a deep breath, then rose and fired rapidly, forcing Quinn's men to take cover. "Go," he hissed, and Grace darted out from behind the boulders, running in a low crouch toward the ravine. Dakota continued firing, tracking the movement of their attackers. Red Bandana had worked his way to the left, while the remaining uninjured man was approaching from the right. The wounded man had taken cover behind a fallen log, but was still managing to provide suppressing fire. When Grace reached the relative safety of the ravine, Dakota began to back away from his position. He had almost reached the edge of the boulder formation when a bullet struck the rock near his head, sending sharp fragments flying. One sliced across his cheek, drawing blood. Dakota dropped to a knee, returning fire. His shot caught the man on the right squarely in the chest. The attacker crumpled without a sound. Taking advantage of the momentary confusion, Dakota sprinted for the ravine. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet, but he reached the edge and half slid, half fell down the steep slope to where Grace waited, her face pale with worry. "You're bleeding," she said, reaching out to touch his cheek. "Later," Dakota replied, taking her arm. "We need to move. They'll be coming after us." They scrambled along the bottom of the ravine, which gradually deepened into a narrow canyon. The walls rose steeply on either side, providing cover but also limiting their escape options. After about half a mile, the canyon opened into a densely wooded area. "We've lost the horses," Grace said, her voice tight with worry, "and most of our supplies." "Can't be helped," Dakota replied. "At least we still have the canteen and some food." He checked his rifle. 4 rounds left. You," Grace showed him the revolver. 5, Dakota nodded grimly. "Let's keep moving. The pass isn't far, but we'll have to go on foot." They pushed on through the forest, the ground steadily rising as they approached the mountain pass. Eleanor began to fuss, hungry and uncomfortable with the constant movement. They paused briefly to allow Grace to feed her, Dakota standing guard with the rifle ready. "How's your side?" he asked, noticing Grace's pained expression as she adjusted Eleanor. "I'll manage," she replied stoically. "The stitches are holding." As evening approached, they reached the base of the pass. The trail ahead wound steeply upward, disappearing into a narrow gap between towering rock faces. "We'll rest here for an hour," Dakota decided, guiding Grace to a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging ledge. "Then we'll try to make it through the pass under cover of darkness." They shared the last of their jerky and a few dried apples Dakota had tucked into his coat pocket. As they ate, Dakota kept watch, listening for any sound of pursuit. "Do you think we've lost them?" Grace asked softly, rocking Eleanor gently in her arms. Dakota shook his head. "They'll be tracking us, but night will slow them down and they don't know the pass like I do." Grace studied his profile in the fading light. "How do you know this area so well?" A shadow passed over Dakota's face. "After the war, I worked as a scout for the army, learned every trail and pass in these mountains." He paused. "Not always work I'm proud of." Grace heard the regret in his voice and understood there was more to his story than he was telling. "We've all done things we regret," she said simply. Dakota met her gaze, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared pain, of paths taken that couldn't be untaken. The moment was broken by a distant sound, the nickering of a horse. "They're coming," Dakota whispered, rising to his feet. "We need to move." With renewed urgency, they began their ascent of the mountain pass. The trail was narrow and treacherous, made more dangerous by the deepening darkness. Dakota led the way, occasionally reaching back to help Grace over particularly difficult sections. Eleanor, perhaps sensing the need for silence, remained quiet, her tiny face pressed against her mother's chest. Grace moved with determination, ignoring the pain in her side and the exhaustion that weighed down her limbs. As they climbed higher, the air grew noticeably colder. Stars appeared overhead, brilliantly clear in the mountain sky. Dakota paused at a switchback, listening intently. "They're still following," he said, his voice barely audible, "but they're being cautious. The trail's too dangerous to rush, especially in the dark." They continued upward, each step bringing them closer to the summit of the pass. The trail narrowed further, in some places barely wide enough for a single person. On one side rose the mountain face, on the other, a sheer drop into darkness. Finally, after what seemed like hours of climbing, they reached a flat area near the top of the pass. A small cave opened in the mountainside, offering shelter from the biting wind that had begun to blow. "We'll rest here," Dakota decided. "The worst of the trail is behind us. Once we cross the summit, it's an easier descent on the other side." Grace sank gratefully onto a smooth rock just inside the cave entrance. Eleanor had finally fallen asleep, exhausted by the journey. "How's your arm?" Grace asked, noticing Dakota's blood-stained sleeve. "Stiff, but it'll heal," he replied, checking the wound in the dim starlight. The bullet had cut a deep furrow across his upper arm, but the bleeding had mostly stopped. Grace tore a strip from the hem of her dress and carefully bound the injury. Her fingers were gentle against his skin, and Dakota found himself unusually aware of her closeness, of the faint scent of wildflowers that somehow clung to her despite days on the trail. "Thank you," he said when she'd finished, "for this and for not giving up. Many would have." Grace's eyes met his. "I could say the same to you. You've risked everything for a woman and child you barely know." Dakota looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I should check the trail," he said, moving to the cave entrance. Outside, he scanned the path below them. In the starlight, he could make out movement. Their pursuers were still coming, maybe half an hour behind them. Dakota returned to the cave, his expression grim. "They're persistent," he told Grace. "We need to reach the summit before they catch up." "The trail on the other side offers more places to hide," Grace nodded, rising carefully with Eleanor still asleep in her arms. "I'm ready." They set out again, following the trail as it wound the final distance to the top of the pass. The wind had grown stronger, cutting through their clothing with icy precision. Eleanor woke and began to cry, the sound quickly whipped away by the gusts. At last, they reached the summit, a narrow ridge connecting two higher peaks. From this vantage point, they could see for miles in either direction. Behind them lay Montana territory, ahead the rugged wilderness of Idaho. "We made it," Grace breathed, a smile breaking across her exhausted face. Dakota nodded, allowing himself a brief moment of satisfaction. "The descent begins just ahead. Once we're down, there's a trapper's cabin where we can—" A gunshot interrupted him, the bullet striking the rock near their feet. Dakota spun around, rifle raised, to see Red Bandana and the wounded man from earlier emerging onto the ridge behind them. "That's far enough," Red Bandana shouted, his voice carrying over the wind. Nowhere left to run, Dakota pushed Grace behind him. "Take Eleanor and start down the other side," he said urgently. "I'll hold them off." "I won't leave you," Grace protested. "You have to," Dakota insisted. "For Eleanor." Their eyes met in the starlight, and Dakota saw the conflict in Grace's expression. Then she nodded once, resolute. "Be careful," she whispered, pressing her hand briefly against his cheek before turning to hurry toward the descent path. Dakota took cover behind a large boulder and sighted along his rifle. The two men were advancing cautiously along the narrow ridge, using the uneven terrain for protection. Dakota fired once, forcing them to take cover, then again when Red Bandana tried to rush forward. 2 rounds left, Dakota thought grimly. He glanced back to see Grace disappearing down the other side of the pass. Good, at least she and Eleanor might escape. Red Bandana called out, his voice carrying on the wind. "Give it up, mister. Quinn's paying good money for that woman and whatever she stole from him. No need for you to die too." Dakota didn't bother responding. Instead, he waited patiently as the wounded man tried to work his way around to the left. When the man exposed himself briefly, Dakota fired, catching him in the shoulder. The man fell with a cry, his gun clattering on the rocky ground. 1 round left. Red Bandana cursed, then made a desperate rush forward, firing as he came. Dakota felt a searing pain in his thigh as a bullet found its mark, but he held his position, waiting until his opponent was close. 20 feet away, Red Bandana stopped, his revolver aimed at Dakota's chest. "Last chance," he growled. "Where's the woman?" Dakota raised his rifle. "Gone," he said simply, and fired his last round. The shot caught Red Bandana squarely in the chest. He staggered backward, shock registering on his face, then toppled over the edge of the ridge into the darkness below. Dakota slumped against the boulder, his leg throbbing painfully. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his thigh, missing bone and major blood vessels, but it was bleeding freely. He tore a strip from his shirt and bound it tightly around the wound. Using the rifle as a makeshift crutch, Dakota began to hobble toward the descent path. The wounded man still lay where he had fallen, moaning softly. Dakota paused beside him. "Quinn," the man gasped, looking up with pain-filled eyes. "He won't stop." "He'll have to," Dakota replied, "because I won't either." Leaving the wounded man behind, Dakota made his way slowly down the western side of the pass. The trail here was gentler than the ascent had been, winding through pine forest rather than along sheer cliff faces. Still, with his injured leg, progress was painfully slow. Dakota had gone perhaps half a mile when he heard someone approaching from ahead. He raised his empty rifle instinctively, then lowered it as Grace appeared around a bend in the trail. "I heard shooting," she said, hurrying to his side. Her eyes widened as she noticed his bloodied leg. "You're hit." "It's not bad," Dakota assured her, though the pain was considerable. "The other 2 won't be following us." Grace helped him to a fallen log where he could sit. Eleanor was secured in a makeshift sling across Grace's chest, sleeping peacefully despite the danger and commotion. "I couldn't leave you," Grace said softly as she examined his wound. "Not after everything you've done for us." Dakota winced as she tightened the makeshift bandage. "You should have kept going. Quinn will send more men. We'll face them together," Grace replied with quiet determination. She offered him her canteen. "The trapper's cabin you mentioned how much further?" "About 3 miles, Dakota said after drinking deeply. "Near a creek at the base of the mountain," Grace nodded. "Can you walk that far?" Dakota met her gaze steadily. "I'll make it." With Grace's help, Dakota got to his feet. Leaning heavily on both the rifle and Grace's shoulder, they began making their way down the mountain trail. Progress was slow, each step a trial for Dakota, but he refused to stop. The sky had begun to lighten with the first hint of dawn when they finally reached the trapper's cabin, a simple 1-room structure built of rough-hewn logs. It was primitive but sound, with a stone fireplace and basic furnishings. "No one's been here in months," Dakota observed as they entered, noting the dust and cobwebs. "Old Jim must have moved on to new territory." Grace helped Dakota to the cabin's single bed, then set about making the place habitable. She found firewood stacked against the outside wall and soon had a small fire going in the fireplace. A search of the cabin's meager supplies yielded some salt, coffee, and dried beans. "Not exactly a feast," she said, "but it will keep us going." While Grace prepared a simple meal, Dakota cleaned and properly bandaged his wounds. The bullet hole in his thigh was painful but straightforward in and out without hitting anything vital. The graze on his arm was superficial, and the cut on his cheek had already begun to heal. As they ate, sitting side by side on the bed with Eleanor nestled between them, Dakota considered their situation. "We should be safe here for a few days," he said. "Long enough for me to recover some strength. Then we'll need to keep moving." Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful. "How far are we from the nearest town?" "There's a small settlement about 20 miles west, mostly miners and a few homesteaders. Not much of a place, but they might have horses we could buy." "With what money?" Grace asked practically. Dakota smiled slightly. "I've got a little saved." "Not much, but enough for horses and supplies." "You've thought of everything," Grace said, a note of admiration in her voice. Dakota shook his head. "Hardly, but I've learned to be prepared." He glanced at Eleanor, who was awake now, her tiny hands waving in the air. She seems to be taking all this excitement in stride. She's stronger than she looks, Grace said softly, her expression tender as she gazed at her daughter. Like her father. Dakota hesitated, then asked the question that had been on his mind. What was he like, your husband? Grace was quiet for a moment, her fingers gently stroking Eleanor's cheek. William was principled, determined. He believed in justice and fairness. That's what got him killed in the end. He couldn't stand by and watch Quinn steal from people who couldn't fight back. She looked up at Dakota. In some ways, you remind me of him. Not in appearance, William was fair-haired and slender, but in your sense of right and wrong, in how you act on those beliefs without hesitation. Dakota felt an unexpected warmth at her words, along with a pang of something like guilt. It had been years since he'd thought of himself as a good man, as someone worthy of such a comparison. I'm sorry you lost him, Dakota said sincerely. Grace's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. So am I, but I'm grateful that Eleanor will have the chance to grow up safe because of what you've done. The simple honesty in her words touched something in Dakota that had been dormant for a very long time. He looked away, uncomfortable with the emotion building in his chest. We should rest, he said, changing the subject. Both of us need to recover our strength. They took turns sleeping, one always keeping watch while the other rested. The day passed quietly, the cabin warming as the sun rose higher. By evening, Dakota was able to move about with the help of a makeshift crutch, though his legs still pained him considerably. Grace had washed their clothes in the creek and hung them to dry by the fire. Wearing one of Dakota's spare shirts, which hung to her knees, she sat cross-legged on the floor, mending the tear in her dress. Tell me about San Francisco, Dakota said as he whittled a piece of wood into a crude rattle for Eleanor. What's your sister like? Grace smiled, her needle flashing in the firelight. Margaret is older than me by 5 years. She's married to a lawyer who's done quite well for himself. They have a fine house on Nob Hill and 3 children. Will they welcome you? Dakota asked. And Eleanor, without question, Grace replied confidently. Margaret wrote to me often after William's death, urging me to come to them. I was hesitant. William and I had built a life in Montana, and it was hard to think of leaving it behind. Her expression darkened. Then Quinn showed his true nature, and the decision was made for me. Dakota nodded, understanding. Family is important. You're fortunate to have somewhere to go. What about you? Grace asked. Do you have family waiting somewhere? Dakota shook his head. Not anymore. My parents died before the war. I had a brother, but he fell at Gettysburg. So you truly are alone, Grace said softly. Dakota continued his whittling, avoiding her gaze. By choice, mostly. After Sarah died after the war, it seemed easier that way. And now, Grace's question hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Dakota finally looked up, meeting her eyes. Now I'm not so sure. The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility and uncertainty. Then Eleanor began to fuss, breaking the spell. Grace set aside her sewing to tend to the baby, and Dakota returned to his carving, but something had shifted, acknowledged if not yet defined. They spent 3 days at the trapper's cabin, allowing Dakota's wounds to heal enough for travel. During that time, a quiet intimacy developed between them, born of shared danger and close quarters, but deepening into something more. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their lives before circumstances had thrown them together. Dakota found himself laughing more than he had in years, drawn out of his solitude by Grace's quiet humor and resilience. On the 4th morning, Dakota tested his leg and found he could put weight on it without too much pain. I think I'm ready to travel, he announced. If we start early, we can reach the settlement by tomorrow evening. Grace nodded, already packing their few belongings. Do you think Quinn will have men looking for us there? Possibly, Dakota admitted, but they won't know we're coming from this direction. Most likely they're still searching the Montana side of the pass or watching the main roads. They set out at dawn, following a game trail that wound through pine forest and across small mountain meadows. Dakota moved slowly but steadily, his limp becoming less pronounced as the day progressed. Grace carried Eleanor in the sling, occasionally singing softly to her when she grew restless. By nightfall, they had covered about half the distance to the settlement. They made camp in a protected hollow, building a small fire for warmth. As they sat side by side, sharing the last of the beans and coffee from the cabin, Dakota found himself acutely aware of Grace's nearness, of the way the firelight played across her features. "What will you do?" Grace asked suddenly. "After we reach San Francisco?" Dakota poked at the fire, considering the question. "I hadn't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "I suppose I could head back to Montana eventually, once the Quinn situation is resolved. Is that what you want, to go back to your homestead, to being alone?" There was something in her tone that made Dakota look up, searching her face. "What else would I do?" he asked quietly. Grace held his gaze, a flush rising in her cheeks. "You could stay in San Francisco. Margaret and Thomas have connections, they could help you find work." "Is that what you want?" Dakota returned her question, his heart suddenly pounding. Grace looked down at Eleanor, sleeping peacefully in her lap. "I want Eleanor to know the man who saved her life, who risked everything for us when he had no reason to." She paused, then added softly, "And yes, I want you to stay." Dakota reached out slowly, his calloused fingers gently tilting her chin up until their eyes met again. Grace, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond their fire, and Dakota was instantly alert, reaching for his rifle. He motioned for Grace to stay down as he rose painfully to his feet, scanning the surrounding forest. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady despite the tension coursing through him. A moment of silence, then a man's voice replied from the darkness. "Don't shoot, friend. Just a traveler saw your fire." Dakota kept his rifle raised. "Step into the light, slowly." A figure emerged from the trees, an elderly man with a long white beard, dressed in buckskins and carrying a well-worn pack. He raised his hands to show he was unarmed. "Name's Ezekiel Parker," the old man said. "Trapping these mountains 40 years now, don't mean no harm." Dakota lowered his rifle slightly but remained wary. "You're a long way from anywhere, Ezekiel," the old man shrugged. "Same could be said for you folks. Mind if I share your fire?" "Night's getting cold." Dakota glanced at Grace, who nodded cautiously. "Come ahead," Dakota said, "but keep your hands where I can see them." Ezekiel settled across the fire from them, his roomy eyes taking in Grace and the baby with undisguised curiosity. "Unusual to see a family in these parts," he observed, "especially traveling on foot. Had some trouble with our horses," Dakota said vaguely. The old man nodded as if this explained everything. "Happens. Seen you came from the direction of old Jim's cabin. He's still about." "Cabin was empty when we found it," Grace said. "Figured as much. Jim talked about heading to Oregon last time I saw him, said his bones couldn't take another mountain winter." Ezekiel pulled a pipe from his pocket and began filling it with tobacco. "You folks heading to Eagle Creek?" Dakota nodded, deciding some truth was safer than obvious lies. "Need to buy horses there. Might be difficult," Ezekiel commented, lighting his pipe. "Town's all stirred up. Some fella came through offering money for information about a woman and baby. Promised a hefty reward." Dakota and Grace exchanged alarmed glances. "When was this?" Dakota asked, trying to keep his voice casual. 2 days back," Ezekiel replied, blowing a smoke ring. "Fancy dresser city man, had a couple rough types with him." The old man's eyes narrowed shrewdly. "Wouldn't happen to be looking for you folks, would he?" Dakota tightened his grip on the rifle. "What makes you say that?" Ezekiel chuckled. "Been in these mountains a long time, son. Seen plenty of folk running from something. Got a nose for it." He nodded toward Grace and Eleanor. "Besides, that baby's too young for its mama to be traipsing through wilderness by choice." After a tense moment, Dakota made a decision. "Yes, they're looking for us. Man named Quinn wants her dead and the baby." He shook his head. "I don't know what he plans for her." Ezekiel studied them thoughtfully, puffing on his pipe. "Quinn," he repeated. "Marshall Quinn, cattle baron from Montana. You know him?" Grace asked sharply. The old man spat into the fire. "Know of him. Bad reputation, greedy. Heard he's buying up land all through the territory, forcing small ranchers out." He looked at Grace. "What you do to cross him, miss?" "My husband had evidence of Quinn's crimes," Grace said after a moment's hesitation. "Quinn killed him for it. I escaped with the proof." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "And now you're running to where?" "California," Dakota answered. "San Francisco." The old trapper considered this, his weathered face thoughtful in the firelight. Eagle Creek ain't safe for you then. Quinn's man has the town watching. Offered $100 for information, big money for folks there. Dakota's heart sank. Without horses, their journey would take weeks longer, and Grace and Eleanor would be exposed to unnecessary hardship. Is there another settlement nearby where we might find horses? Nothing closer than 2 days' hard ride, Ezekiel replied. Then he seemed to come to a decision. But I might be able to help. Got a cabin about 5 miles from here, and I got 2 horses old like me but sound. Why would you help us? Grace asked. Ezekiel's eyes crinkled. Never did like bullies, miss. Man who'd hunt a woman and baby well, he ain't right in my book. He knocked the ash from his pipe. Besides, getting too old for this mountain life. Been thinking of visiting my daughter in Sacramento. This seems like a good time to start. Dakota studied the old man carefully, searching for any sign of deception. Finding none, he nodded. We'd be grateful for your help, Ezekiel, and we can pay you for the horses. We'll discuss that later, the trapper said, rising stiffly to his feet. Best we move on tonight. If Quinn's men are in Eagle Creek, they might have patrols out looking. They quickly doused the fire and gathered their few possessions. With Ezekiel leading the way, they set off through the darkened forest. The old man moved with surprising agility despite his age, navigating the difficult terrain with the confidence of long familiarity. True to his word, after several hours of difficult travel, they reached a small log cabin nestled in a protected valley. Unlike the abandoned trapper's cabin they'd stayed in previously, Ezekiel's home was well-maintained and comfortable, with a stone fireplace, sturdy furniture, and shelves lined with supplies. Not much, Ezekiel said as he lit a lamp, but it's home. Grace sank gratefully onto a bench near the fire, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Eleanor had awakened during the journey and was now fussing quietly, hungry and uncomfortable. There's a room through there, Ezekiel said, pointing to a door at the back of the cabin. Nothing fancy, but the bed's clean. You and the little one can have it. Thank you, Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. For everything. The old man nodded gruffly, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. Get some rest. We've got planning to do come morning. Dakota helped Grace settle in the small bedroom, making sure she had everything she needed for Eleanor. When he returned to the main room, Ezekiel was heating coffee on the stove. Your leg's troubling you, the trapper observed, noting Dakota's pronounced limp. Dakota nodded. Took a bullet a few days back. It's healing, but the walking didn't help. Ezekiel rummaged in a cabinet and produced a small brown bottle. Willow bark tincture, good for pain. He passed it to Dakota. Few drops in your coffee. Dakota accepted the bottle with thanks, adding the medicine to his cup. The two men sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire crackled in the hearth. She's a strong one, Ezekiel finally commented. Most women would have broken by now with what she's been through. Dakota nodded. She is that. The old man studied him over the rim of his cup. And you, what's your stake in this? She your kin? No, Dakota replied. She showed up at my door bleeding with the baby. Asked me to kill her quickly before Quinn's men could get her. He shook his head at the memory. Couldn't do that. Decided to help instead. Ezekiel's bushy eyebrows rose. That's some decision, putting yourself between a man like Quinn and his prey. Dakota shrugged. Seemed like the only choice at the time. And now, Ezekiel pressed. Still feel that way, Dakota stared into the fire, considering the question. Now it's personal, he said finally. Quinn's men have tried to kill us multiple times, and Grace and Eleanor. He trailed off, not quite ready to put into words the feelings that had been growing within him. The old trapper nodded as if Dakota had confirmed something he'd already suspected. Well, come morning, we'll get you on your way. I know some trails that'll keep you off the main roads all the way to the Oregon border. We're in your debt, Dakota said sincerely. Ezekiel waved away his thanks. Get some sleep, son. Tomorrow comes early. The following day, they prepared for their journey. Ezekiel provided them with supplies, food, ammunition, extra clothing, and a small tent. His 2 horses, though old, were sturdy mountain ponies accustomed to difficult terrain. This map shows the trails, Ezekiel explained, spreading a hand-drawn chart on the table. Keep to these routes and you'll avoid the main settlements where Quinn might have men watching. Dakota studied the map carefully, committing it to memory. How long to reach Oregon? 10 days, maybe 12, depending on weather and how fast you travel, Ezekiel replied. Once you're in Oregon, head for Portland. From there, you can take a steamer to San Francisco. Grace, who had been helping pack the saddlebags, looked up at this. What about you? Will you come with us? The old man shook his head. Got some business to settle first. I'll follow in a week or so, meet you in Sacramento. He smiled at her concern. Don't worry about me, miss. Been taking care of myself longer than you've been alive. By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. Dakota helped Grace mount one of the horses, then secured Eleanor in the sling across her chest. The baby was wide-eyed and alert, seemingly fascinated by the horses and the activity around her. Dakota turned to Ezekiel, extending his hand. I don't know how to thank you properly. The old trapper gripped his hand firmly. Live well, that's thanks enough. He glanced at Grace and Eleanor. Take care of them. World needs more good men than it has. I will, Dakota promised. With final farewells, they set off, following the first of the trails Ezekiel had marked on his map. The morning was clear and cool, the mountains around them painted in shades of green and blue beneath a cloudless sky. Despite the dangers that still lay ahead, Dakota felt a cautious optimism he hadn't experienced in years. They traveled steadily through the day, stopping occasionally to rest the horses and tend to Eleanor. Grace rode well despite her recent injury, her back straight and her gaze alert as they navigated the mountain trails. By evening, they had covered nearly 15 miles, putting significant distance between themselves and Eagle Creek. They made camp in a sheltered grove of pines, setting up the small tent Ezekiel had provided. After a simple meal of jerky, hardtack, and dried fruit, they sat side by side near the small fire, Eleanor sleeping peacefully between them. Do you think we'll make it? Grace asked, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. Dakota nodded. Quinn's influence doesn't extend much beyond Montana territory. Once we reach Oregon, we should be safer, and San Francisco is far beyond his reach. Grace was silent for a moment, her face thoughtful in the firelight. And what then? For you, I mean. Dakota poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the night air. I've been thinking about that, he said slowly. About what you said last night before Ezekiel arrived. Grace's breath caught. Yes, Dakota turned to face her, his expression serious. I don't want to go back to Montana, not to being alone. He paused, gathering his courage. If you'll have me, I'd like to come to San Francisco, too, to be part of your lives, yours and Eleanor's. Grace's eyes shimmered in the firelight. Are you certain? It would mean leaving everything behind. There's nothing for me there anymore, Dakota said simply. But with you and Eleanor. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. With you, I see a future worth having. Grace's fingers tightened around his. I'd like that, she whispered. Very much. Dakota leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, she met him halfway, her lips soft against his in a gentle, tentative kiss. When they broke apart, both were smiling. It's too soon, Grace said, though her eyes belied her words. William's been gone less than a month. I shouldn't. We have time, Dakota assured her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. All the time we need. The journey to Oregon proved challenging but uneventful. They maintained a steady pace, following Ezekiel's map through remote mountain passes and hidden valleys. The weather held fair, and the horses performed admirably despite their age. Dakota and Grace fell into a comfortable routine, sharing the tasks of making and breaking camp, caring for Eleanor, and tending the horses. With each passing day, the easy companionship between them deepened, growing into something neither had expected to find again. On the 10th day, they crested a ridge to find the Columbia River spread before them, a silver ribbon winding through the landscape. Oregon territory lay on the other side, and with it, a sense of having passed beyond Quinn's reach. We made it, Grace breathed, her face alight with relief and joy. Dakota nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. We still have a long way to go, he cautioned, but yes, we've made it past the worst. They made their way down to the river. and found a ferry crossing operated by a taciturn man who asked no questions as he transported them to the southern bank. By nightfall, they had reached a small settlement where they were able to purchase supplies and spend a night in a proper bed at the local boarding house. The following morning, they set out for Portland, now able to follow established roads without fear of pursuit. The countryside gradually became more settled, farms and small towns replacing the wilderness they had traversed for so many days. 5 days later, they reached Portland, a bustling port city that seemed impossibly crowded and noisy after their time in the mountains. They sold Ezekiel's horses to a livery stable for a fair price, then secured passage on a steamer bound for San Francisco. The sea voyage lasted 4 days, during which Eleanor experienced her first fever. Grace was frantic with worry, but a kindly ship's doctor provided medicine that soon had the baby sleeping peacefully again. Her temperature returning to normal. Throughout the crisis, Dakota had remained steady, offering support and comfort to Grace. As they stood at the ship's rail on the final evening of the journey, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she said quietly. "Not just now, but from the beginning." Dakota's arm tightened around her waist. "You're stronger than you know, Grace. You would have found a way." She shook her head. "Perhaps, but I'm glad I didn't have to." She looked up at him, her expression serious. "I want you to know that. That what I feel for you isn't just gratitude, it's more than that." Dakota's heart quickened at her words. "For me too," he said simply. They arrived in San Francisco the following day. The city was even larger and more overwhelming than Portland had been, with towering buildings, crowded streets, and a constant cacophony of sound. Dakota, who had spent so many years in the solitude of the Montana wilderness, found himself disoriented by the press of humanity. Grace, however, navigated the city with confidence, securing a carriage to take them to her sister's home on Nob Hill. As they ascended the steep streets, the neighborhoods grew increasingly elegant, the houses larger and more ornate. "Are you nervous?" Dakota asked as they approached their destination. Grace smiled, adjusting Eleanor in her arms. "A little. It's been 3 years since I've seen Margaret, but she's family." The carriage stopped before an impressive 3-story house with a columned entrance and manicured gardens. Before they had even reached the door, it flew open, and a slender woman with honey-colored hair similar to Grace's rushed out. "Grace. Oh my God, Grace." Margaret Thompson Russell swept her sister into a careful embrace, mindful of the baby between them. "I can't believe you're really here." Tears flowed freely as the sisters reunited. Dakota hung back, allowing them their moment. Eventually, Margaret seemed to notice him for the first time. "And who is this?" she asked, her eyes curious as she took in Dakota's trail-worn appearance. "This is Dakota Vance," Grace said, reaching back to draw him forward. "He saved our lives, Margaret. Without him, Eleanor and I wouldn't be here." Margaret's expression softened. "Then we are forever in your debt, Mr. Vance." She extended her hand, which Dakota took somewhat awkwardly. "Please, both of you come inside. You must be exhausted." The interior of the Russell home was as impressive as its exterior: high ceilings, elegant furniture, and artwork that Dakota suspected cost more than his entire homestead in Montana. A distinguished-looking man with silver at his temples came forward to greet them. "Thomas, this is my sister Grace and her daughter Eleanor," Margaret said, "and this is Mr. Dakota Vance, who brought them safely to us." Thomas Russell shook Dakota's hand firmly. "Welcome to our home. Any friend of Grace's is family to us." The next hours passed in a whirlwind of introductions, explanations, and arrangements. Margaret and Thomas insisted that both Grace and Dakota stay with them, at least until they could find their feet in San Francisco. A room was prepared for Grace and Eleanor, while Dakota was given a comfortable guest chamber. That evening, after a dinner that was more elaborate than any Dakota had experienced in years, the 4 adults gathered in Thomas's study. Over brandy and coffee, Grace recounted their journey, with Dakota occasionally adding details. She left nothing out: William's murder, Quinn's pursuit, and Dakota's unwavering protection throughout their ordeal. When she had finished, Thomas's expression was grave. This man, Quinn, sounds dangerous. Even at this distance, I'm concerned for your safety. What about the evidence you have against him? Margaret asked. The document proving his fraud. Grace produced the now wrinkled paper from her bodice where she had carried it throughout their journey. Here. William believed it would be enough to ruin Quinn, possibly send him to prison. Thomas examined the document carefully, his lawyer's mind assessing its value. This is indeed damning evidence, he confirmed. With this, and your testimony as a witness to the murder, Quinn could face the gallows. But that would require Grace to return to Montana, Dakota pointed out, concern evident in his voice. It's too dangerous. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps not immediately, but I have colleagues in the territorial courts. This evidence could be submitted through proper channels, with Grace's testimony taken here in California and forwarded to Montana. Would that be enough? Grace asked. It might be, Thomas replied. Quinn's reputation is already questionable, with this evidence and the right pressure applied. He smiled grimly. Leave it to me, I have some experience in these matters. Later that night, as the house settled into silence, Dakota stood at the window of his room, looking out at the lights of San Francisco spread below him. The city was a world away from the mountains and plains he had known all his life. He wondered if he could ever truly belong here. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Grace standing in the hallway, dressed in a borrowed nightgown and robe. May I come in? She asked quietly. Dakota stepped aside, acutely aware that they were no longer alone in the wilderness but in her sister's respectable home. Grace seemed to read his thoughts. Eleanor is asleep, she said. Margaret is watching over her. I wanted to talk to you. Dakota gestured to a pair of chairs near the window. They sat facing each other, the city lights creating a backdrop of twinkling stars. It's all so strange, Grace said, looking around the elegant room. A month ago, I was in Montana, believing my life was settled. Now everything has changed. Her gaze returned to Dakota. Except for you. From the moment I appeared on your doorstep, you've been my one constant. Dakota took her hands in his. I meant what I said on the trail. I want to be part of your life, yours and Eleanor's if you'll have me, even here. Grace asked, glancing toward the window and the unfamiliar city beyond. This isn't your world, Dakota. My world is wherever you are, he replied simply. The rest I can learn. Grace's eyes filled with tears. I don't deserve you. You deserve everything good in this world, Dakota said fiercely. After what you've endured, you deserve peace and happiness and safety. He paused, then added softly, I want to be the one to give you those things if I can. Grace rose from her chair and moved to kneel before him, her hands resting on his knees. Dakota Vance, she said, her voice steady despite the tears that now flowed freely down her cheeks. I have loved you since the moment you didn't kill me when I asked. I will love you for all the days that follow. Whatever life brings us, I want to face it with you. Dakota reached down to cradle her face in his hands. Then you shall, he whispered, before lowering his lips to hers. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity and adjustment. Thomas, true to his word, set legal proceedings in motion against Marshall Quinn. The evidence Grace had provided, combined with Thomas's connections in legal and political circles, created a mounting pressure on the Montana authorities to investigate Quinn's activities. Dakota, meanwhile, found himself adapting to city life with surprising ease. Thomas, impressed by Dakota's integrity and resourcefulness, offered him a position managing the security of his various business interests. The work suited Dakota's skills and provided him with a sense of purpose and independence. Grace flourished in her sister's home, regaining her strength and spirits. Eleanor grew daily, her tiny features becoming more defined, her personality beginning to emerge. Margaret doted on her niece, and her 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, all under 10, were fascinated by their new cousin. 6 weeks after their arrival in San Francisco, news reached them from Montana. Marshall Quinn had been arrested and charged with the murder of William Thompson, as well as multiple counts of fraud and corruption. Several of his men, facing charges themselves, had turned against him, providing additional evidence of his crimes. It's over, Grace said that evening as she and Dakota walked in the Russells' garden. He can't hurt us anymore. Dakota nodded, relief evident in his expression. Thomas thinks Quinn will hang. Too many people testifying against him now. Grace was quiet for a moment. I should feel satisfaction, I suppose, justice for William, but mostly I just feel free, like I can finally look forward instead of always looking over my shoulder. Dakota stopped walking and turned to face her. The setting sun painted her hair with gold, reminding him of that first evening on his porch in Montana, when she had appeared like a wounded angel in the fading light. I've been thinking about the future too, he said, reaching into his pocket. About us. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box, a purchase that had consumed much of his savings. Opening it, he revealed a simple gold ring set with a single modest diamond. I know it's soon, he said, his voice suddenly uncertain. William's been gone less than 3 months. If you need more time, I understand, but I wanted you to know my intentions. When you're ready, if you're ready, I want to marry you, Grace, to be a father to Eleanor, to build a life together. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she looked from the ring to Dakota's face. It is soon, she agreed softly. By conventional standards, at least. She smiled through her tears. But we've never been conventional, have we? Not since the moment I appeared on your doorstep and asked you to kill me. Dakota chuckled despite the emotion tightening his throat. Not exactly a traditional beginning. Grace reached out to touch the ring, her fingers trembling slightly. William would want me to be happy, she said thoughtfully, to find love again, to give Eleanor a father who will love and protect her. She met Dakota's gaze steadily. And I do love you, Dakota Vance, with all my heart. Dakota held his breath. Is that a yes? Instead of answering with words, Grace threw her arms around his neck and kissed him deeply, passionately. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling. Yes, Grace whispered against his lips. 1,000 times yes. They were married 3 months later in the garden of the Russell home. It was a small ceremony, attended only by Margaret, Thomas, their children, and a few close friends. Eleanor, now 5 months old, watched the proceedings from Margaret's arms, occasionally burbling as if offering her approval. Grace wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her honey-colored hair adorned with white roses. Dakota, dressed in a new suit that still felt somewhat foreign to him, waited beneath an arbor covered in climbing roses, his heart pounding as he watched his bride approach. As they exchanged their vows, Dakota's thoughts returned briefly to that fateful night on his porch in Montana. Just kill me fast, she had said, her eyes wild with fear and desperation. Instead, he had taken her in, protected her, learned to love her. And in saving her, he had somehow saved himself as well. The reception that followed was joyful but intimate. As the evening drew to a close, Dakota found a moment alone with his new bride in a quiet corner of the garden. Happy? He asked, drawing her close. Grace smiled up at him, her eyes bright with contentment. More than I ever thought possible. She glanced across the garden to where Eleanor was being fussed over by her cousins. And you, do you ever miss Montana, the solitude? Dakota considered the question honestly. Sometimes, he admitted, the mountains get in your blood, but solitude isn't the same as peace. He kissed her forehead gently. And I've found more peace with you and Eleanor than I ever had alone. They remained in San Francisco for another year, living in a comfortable house not far from Margaret and Thomas. Dakota's work for Thomas expanded into other ventures, revealing a shrewd business mind that surprised even him. Grace, meanwhile, began teaching music to the children of San Francisco's elite, rekindling a passion she had set aside during her years in Montana. Eleanor grew into a beautiful, spirited child with her mother's honey-colored hair and a smile that could melt the coldest heart. She called Dakota Papa from her earliest words, and he treasured the title more than any other he had ever held. News occasionally reached them from Montana. Quinn had indeed been hanged for his crimes, his empire dismantled and distributed among those he had wronged. Dakota's homestead had been sold to a young family just starting out, a fitting continuation for the place that had sheltered him during his years of solitude. As Eleanor's first birthday approached, Dakota surprised Grace with an announcement. I've purchased land, he told her one evening as they sat on the porch of their San Francisco home, watching the sunset over the bay. A ranch north of here in the Napa Valley. Good soil, plenty of water. Room for horses. He took her hand. Room for a family to grow. Grace's eyes widened. You want to leave the city? Dakota smiled. Not too far, close enough to visit Margaret and Thomas regularly. But yes, I miss the open spaces, and I thought you might too. Grace was quiet for a moment, considering. I have missed it, she admitted. The sky seems smaller here somehow, more confined. She squeezed his hand. Tell me about this ranch. Dakota's face lit up as he described the property, the rolling hills, the creek that ran year-round, the stand of ancient oaks that would provide shade in summer. As he spoke, Grace could see it all in her mind's eye, could imagine Eleanor growing up with room to run and explore, with animals to care for and nature to learn from. It sounds perfect, she said when he had finished. When can we see it? They visited the ranch the following weekend. As their carriage crested the final hill, revealing the valley spread before them, Grace gasped in delight. The land was everything Dakota had described, and more, a perfect blend of wilderness and civilization, with mountains in the distance and fertile fields close at hand. The house was modest but sound, built of local stone and timber with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Inside, spacious rooms with large windows captured light and views from every angle. We can add on as needed, Dakota said as they explored. More bedrooms for future children, perhaps. Grace caught the hesitation in his voice and turned to face him. Is that what you want? More children? Dakota nodded, suddenly shy. If you do, I never thought I'd be a father at all, and now that I am to Eleanor, I find I want more. A house full of laughter and little footsteps. Grace's eyes shimmered with happiness. I want that too, she whispered, stepping into his embrace. Very much. They moved to the ranch a month later. Eleanor adapted quickly to country life. Delighting in the animals, Dakota began to acquire horses, a milk cow, chickens, and a gentle old dog named Bear who appointed himself her guardian. By the time Eleanor was 2, the family had grown to include a son, William Dakota Vance, named for the father he would never know and the father who had chosen him. Grace's pregnancy had been easy, the birth straightforward, and the baby healthy and strong from his first breath. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm of seasons and growth. Dakota's business acumen, combined with his practical skills, made the ranch prosper. Grace's musical talents found an outlet in teaching their children and organizing gatherings where neighbors came together to share music and fellowship. More children followed, twin girls, Sarah and Margaret, when Eleanor was 5, and another boy, Thomas, 2 years later. The house expanded along with the family, additional rooms and a second story added as needed, always with Dakota's careful craftsmanship. On the 10th anniversary of the night Grace had appeared on Dakota's porch in Montana, they held a celebration at the ranch. Friends and family gathered from near and far, filling the house and spilling onto the grounds. Margaret and Thomas came from San Francisco with their now grown children. Ezekiel Parker, who had indeed followed them to California and now lived in a small cabin on their property, entertained the younger children with tales of his mountain adventures. As evening fell, Dakota found Grace sitting alone on a bench beneath the oak trees, watching their children play a game of chase across the lawn. Eleanor, now a beautiful young woman of 10, was leading her siblings in the game, her laughter carrying on the warm summer air. Dakota sat beside his wife, taking her hand in his. Penny for your thoughts, Grace smiled, leaning against his shoulder. I was thinking about how far we've come, how much has changed in 10 years. Any regrets? Dakota asked, his voice gentle. Grace shook her head. Not one. Every step of the journey brought us here, to this moment, to this life we've built together. She looked up at him, love shining in her eyes. You saved us that night, Dakota. You opened your door to a desperate woman and a newborn child, and you changed all our lives forever. Dakota brought her hand to his lips, kissing it softly. You saved me too, he said simply. I was dead inside before you came, just going through the motions of living. He gazed out at their children, his expression full of wonder. You gave me back my heart, Grace. You and Eleanor and all the rest. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Dakota and Grace remained on their bench, hand in hand, watching their children play. The journey that had begun in fear and desperation had led them here to love, to family, to a life richer and more fulfilling than either could have imagined on that fateful night when a wounded woman had appeared on a lonely porch and whispered, "Just kill me fast." Instead, Dakota had chosen life for her, for Eleanor, and ultimately for himself. It was a choice neither would ever regret.